Tonight, we uncover a manuscript so dangerous it was never meant to be seen again. Not buried in the sands of time, but hidden in silence by those who feared what it could awaken. It was not written by a priest or a prophet, but by a civilization the church tried to erase. A book filled with forgotten rituals, cosmic alignments, forbidden rites and symbols that echo louder than any sermon. For centuries, the Vatican has guarded its secrets with stone, with fire, and with fear. But deep beneath their archives, something older remained. A text wrapped in Egyptian magic, speaking of beings with wings of fire memory that could be broken, and a light that was stolen from humanity itself. This is not just lost history, this is stolen divinity. It is a story of mirrors, ciphers, relics, and silence, and it threatens the very timeline the church was built to protect. So before the door closes, ask yourself, what if the greatest danger is not in reading the text, but in remembering it? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we open the most dangerous book the Vatican ever found. It started with a rumour, whispers slipping through Cairo's crowded alleys, murmured in the shadows of crumbling temples and quiet cafes. An archaeologist had found something, not a statue, not a scroll, a book, bound in a strange black leather that shimmered like oil under the desert sun. No one could say where it came from. No one dared say who it really belonged to. But those who saw it swore it pulsed, like it was alive. The year was 1932. A European collector named Renaud had purchased it from a man who simply called himself the Keeper. The transaction happened in silence. No names, no documents. Only the book, wrapped in cloth, passed from one trembling hand to another. Renaud brought it back to his rented flat near the Nile and opened it by candlelight. What he saw inside made him forget to breathe. It wasn't just the writing, though even that was strange. Symbols that looked like hieroglyphs, but older, more fluid, more alive. It was the drawings, maps of stars that didn't match any known sky, human figures with no faces, eyes in the margins, diagrams that twisted into themselves like they were folding time. Renaud wrote one letter to a contact in Rome and then disappeared. Vanished, no trace. His apartment untouched, except the book was gone. 10 years passed. A war came and went. And then, in the back room of a forgotten monastery in southern Egypt, the book resurfaced. Hidden beneath cracked stone tiles, inside a box sealed with wax and etched in Greek, Latin, and something far more ancient. The monks who found it didn't speak. They knew. They sent a message. Not to the local authorities, not to a museum, to the Vatican. 2 men arrived the next day. They wore plain black robes and carried no identification. The head monk was never seen again. The manuscript was taken in silence. No photographs, no inventory. Only the lingering scent of candle smoke and something metallic in the air. The kind of feeling you get when something important leaves a room. Back in Rome, the manuscript was locked away, its existence denied. The Vatican called it dangerous, unstable. Some even said it was cursed, but the truth was more unsettling. It wasn't just what the book said, it was what it remembered, what it refused to forget. A world before the Bible, before the church, before memory was rewritten. The story should have ended there, sealed behind marble and silence. But it didn't. Because sometimes a book doesn't just vanish. Sometimes it waits. It waits for someone who can read between the lines, someone who still remembers what was erased. And that's where this story begins. The monastery looked forgotten. Its stone walls crumbled under the desert heat. The crosses etched into the sandstone were faded and cracked like they were holding in secrets. No one had prayed there in decades, maybe centuries. But something beneath the surface was still waiting. It started when a team of archaeologists arrived with a grant to study early Coptic Christian ruins. Nothing unusual, just another expedition in a land full of bones and broken columns. But 3 days into the dig, one of them heard a hollow sound, not an echo, a voice trapped in stone. They dug deeper, cleared sand with their hands when the tools seemed too loud. And then the floor gave way. Beneath the monastery was a hidden vault, perfectly sealed, carved with symbols no one could identify. Not Greek, not Latin, not even hieroglyphs. Something older. Something no one wanted to admit might be real. The team hesitated. It felt wrong, cold, like the air hadn't moved in thousands of years. But curiosity always wins. Inside, they found artifacts wrapped in cloth that hadn't rotted. Objects made of materials they couldn't explain. A mirror polished to a perfect black surface that reflected nothing. A staff carved with spirals that twisted into infinity. And scrolls. Scrolls so brittle they seemed to whisper when touched. But the real shock wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't expect. One of the scrolls held a symbol that matched a fragment found earlier in the Vatican's own archives. A symbol that had never been publicly shown, that was supposed to have been destroyed, yet here it was, buried in Egypt, beneath a Christian monastery, written in a language that shouldn't exist. The lead archaeologist wanted to document everything, but 2 of his team members left the site without warning. One claimed he had a dream where the vault opened itself and showed him something that made him cry for hours. The other refused to speak at all, just packed his things and walked into the desert. Within a week, the site was shut down. The official report said, structural collapse, no funding, no access, nothing to see. But everyone who had been there knew better. The monastery wasn't just a ruin, it was a mask. And whatever it was hiding had been hidden on purpose. Some believe the vault predates not just Christianity, but all known history, that it belonged to a civilization erased from memory, a culture that didn't worship gods but spoke to them, traded with them, documented them. Whatever the truth is, the Vatican moved fast. The site is now off limits. Satellite images blurred. Records sealed. The desert has buried it again. But not forever, because the sand only hides what memory forgets. And memory is starting to wake up. The first time someone opened the manuscript, they expected dust and brittle parchment. Instead, they found pages that felt like skin but weren't. Smooth and cold, almost too perfect, bound in obsidian black leather that seemed to drink in the light. It didn't reflect. It absorbed, like it knew what it was hiding. The symbols inside weren't hieroglyphs, not really. They had the shape of Egyptian writing, but not the logic. They curved in impossible directions. Some looked like they were meant to move. Others shimmered when touched, like heat rising off stone. Linguists tried to categorize them. Greek roots, maybe. No. Phoenician? No. Sumerian? Closer, but still wrong. This wasn't just an ancient language, it was a forgotten one that didn't evolve into anything else. It vanished, or was erased. One expert said it looks like a form of pre-dynastic communication, but the problem with that theory was simple. Pre-dynastic Egyptians didn't write. They drew, they painted. They didn't bind books in black leather and etch spells into the margins. Because that's what they were, spells, rituals, not prayers, instructions. Some of the pages were written backward, not mirrored, backward, as if they were meant to be read by something on the other side. Others had no beginning or end, just continuous loops of text that trapped your eyes until you looked away or got dizzy. There were no chapter breaks, no explanations, just symbols layered over more symbols, every page more cryptic than the last. What disturbed people most wasn't that they couldn't translate it. It was that parts of it felt familiar. A symbol that looked like a distorted ankh, a line that resembled the Hebrew aleph but stretched like it was screaming. Things from different languages and ages all crammed together like they were trying to speak with one voice, a voice no one wanted to hear. Then there were the margins, filled with tiny drawings, not decorative, observational. Images of temples that don't exist on any map, celestial diagrams of moons and stars that orbit nothing, and faces. So many faces, but none had eyes, just empty sockets. Every face looking straight out of the page. Everyone seeming to know you were there. The Vatican called the book unstable, said it wasn't safe to keep it in the main archives, that it had to be locked in a subvault, usually reserved for cursed relics and condemned texts. But the real reason was simpler. No one could read it, and yet everyone who tried saw something different, as if the book changed itself, depending on who held it. One scholar went blind after 3 days of study. Another claimed he could hear the pages breathing at night. A third simply vanished. All that was left was his notebook, and written on the final page were 4 words. It's not a book. The first translator was a professor in Milan, quiet, careful, known for his work on ancient languages no one else could read. When the manuscript arrived in his office, he thought it was just another curiosity. He opened it, took notes, spent 4 nights trying to match the script with anything in his records. On the 5th night, his housekeeper found him collapsed on the floor. No marks, no wounds. His heart had just stopped. The last thing he'd written on his desk was a single phrase underlined twice. Not meant for us. A week later, a Vatican linguist took over. This one was younger, arrogant. He believed in science, not superstition. He laughed at the idea of a curse. He lasted 2 days. A security guard found him slumped over the manuscript, eyes wide open, mouth still mid-sentence. His lips were stained red. They said it looked like he'd bitten through his tongue. The manuscript was untouched, but someone had scrawled a warning across the margin in fresh blood. Don't wake it. By now, people were whispering. The archivists refused to go near it. One nun claimed she heard voices coming from the vault. Not chanting, not prayer, just breathing, heavy, slow. Like something asleep was listening, watching. A third translator was flown in from Cairo. She was quiet, distant. Said she had dreamed of the manuscript long before she saw it. She didn't try to decode it. Instead, she traced the symbols with her fingers and said they felt warm, alive. She lasted 3 hours. Cameras in the reading chamber caught her staring at a page without blinking. Then, as if possessed, she stood, walked to the wall, and began writing symbols in her own blood. When guards rushed in, she collapsed. Her final word was a whisper: return. The Vatican called for silence. No press, no leaks. They claimed the deaths were unrelated, natural. But behind closed doors, panic was growing. This wasn't just an ancient book. It was doing something. Reaching. Theories spread among the scholars. That it wasn't meant to be read. That the symbols were a kind of key. That reading them unlocked something that had been locked away for a reason. Some began to believe it was a test. That the book only allowed certain people to read it without punishment. People who shared some kind of forgotten lineage, bloodline. Others said it was a warning, not about the past, but about the future. That decoding it was like lighting a match in a room full of sleeping monsters. After the third death, the Vatican sealed the manuscript away, deep beneath the archives. Behind iron doors and layers of salt and prayer, they said it was for safety. But some think it was fear, because whatever is in that book doesn't want to be read. And maybe it never did. They don't wear collars, they don't carry crosses, and they don't answer questions. But everyone inside the Vatican knows what it means when the Jesuit retrieval team is activated. It means something dangerous has resurfaced, something ancient, something that needs to disappear again. The team isn't listed on any official document. They're not part of any public order. But behind the walls of the Vatican, they have a name, Custodes Silenti, the Keepers of Silence. Recruited from Jesuit seminaries, trained in more than just theology, these men learn forgotten dialects, dead alphabets, and how to recognize forbidden symbols before anyone else. Their training includes psychological conditioning, emergency exorcism protocols, and how to disappear entire texts without leaving a trace. When the manuscript deaths began piling up, the Vatican didn't send a scholar. They sent the team. The jet was fueled within hours. Destination, Cairo. The mission wasn't to study the manuscript. It was to extract it, quietly, permanently. They landed at night, no lights, no records. They moved like shadows. In the morning, the museum curator reported a break-in. Nothing stolen, just one display case cracked open. No fingerprints, no footage, only a single feather left on the marble floor, black, oily. Like it didn't belong to any bird on earth. By the time the curator realized what was missing, the manuscript was already sealed in a lead-lined crate on its way to Vatican airspace. The retrieval team didn't stay to answer questions. They never do. That's part of their job, to make sure the world forgets what it almost found. Inside the Vatican, the manuscript was taken directly to the deep archives, not the public ones tourists visit. The real archives, the ones that don't appear on maps. Past the locked gates, beneath the catacombs, past the rooms lined with forbidden scrolls, bound demons, and mirrors that show events that never happened. The team handed it off without ceremony. They never asked what it was. They didn't need to. What mattered was that it would never be seen again. But one member of the team stayed behind. He wasn't like the others, younger, restless, curious. He didn't follow orders the way he was supposed to. 3 days later, he vanished. His name erased from the logs. His room sealed. The others were told he had returned to the seminary. But a nun who cleaned the floor swore she saw something scribbled on his wall before it was painted over. A single phrase. It's not the first time. The Vatican never acknowledged the mission. The museum never filed a report. And the manuscript? It was locked behind iron doors and buried under holy seals. But the Jesuits know the truth, because this wasn't the first retrieval, and it won't be the last. At first glance, the manuscript looked like nonsense. Scribbles, strange lines, symbols twisted in on themselves. But the longer you stared, the more it started to feel like something was staring back. Not just language, intention. Like the pages were alive and waiting to be read by the right person. Buried in the center of the book, hidden between layers of decoy symbols, was something else. A pattern, spells. Not the kind you find in fairy tales. These were instructions. diagrams. Step-by-step guides for doing things that should be impossible. Changing light, freezing shadows, making time move differently inside a room. Every ritual was drawn with such detail that it felt like whoever wrote them had actually done it. Some spells had tiny notes beside them, not in Latin, not in Greek, in something older, pre-biblical, even before the oldest Sumerian tablets. It looked like Egyptian, but distorted, bent out of shape like it had been passed through too many hands. Still, some of the diagrams were clearly recognizable. Circles drawn in ash, copper blades dipped in oil, figures kneeling before flame-shaped altars. One of the strangest pages showed a human figure split into 3 shadows. Each shadow had a name. Not names we use, names that burned to say out loud. Another page had a star chart, but the stars didn't match our sky. They formed patterns no astronomer could recognize, except one. The central star. It was there, Sirius. The dog star. The ancient Egyptians worshipped it as a doorway. The manuscript seemed to agree. The more scholars looked at it, the more they realized this wasn't some late magical text. It didn't borrow from religion. It came before it, before the Bible, before temples, before gods had names. This was the raw form of something people would later call magic, the source code of belief itself. Some of the diagrams showed how to break things apart, not physically, spiritually. A page described how to remove fear from the mind and store it in an object. Another showed how to summon a shadow without casting one, not metaphor, actual instructions. But the most disturbing page didn't have text, just a single drawing, a doorway, surrounded by runes, and at the bottom, in red ink, a phrase in broken Greek. Do not open unless it's already here. The Vatican banned further study, claimed the magic was too dangerous, that it was never meant for human hands. But not everyone agreed. One Jesuit secretly made a copy of the page with the doorway. He hid it in the spine of another book and smuggled it out. They say he later tried one of the rituals. Not all of it, just the first few steps, but something responded. Lights flickered, clocks froze, and he swore the walls began to whisper in a language he didn't understand. That was the last time anyone saw him. Only the whispers remain. They were never mentioned in the pyramids, never carved into temple walls. No statues, no shrines, no songs. But hidden deep in the manuscript was a name that kept surfacing like a ghost. The Keepers of the Lightless Flame. A priesthood older than the pharaohs, older than Egypt itself. A group so secret that even the other priests were afraid to speak of them. The manuscript didn't just hint at them, it centered around them. Diagrams of rituals were labelled with the same strange symbol over and over again. A serpent swallowing a flame that gave off no light. One passage described a ceremony in total darkness, where the only illumination came from sound. Not candles, not stars, just chanting that bent the walls of reality. According to the manuscript, these keepers were trusted with something far more powerful than any crown or scepter. They didn't serve a god, they served a force, one that predated the pantheon, not evil, not good, just raw. The kind of force that could fold time, erase memories, or open doorways between dimensions that most people didn't even believe existed. Their legacy wasn't passed down through scrolls or carvings. It was whispered from mouth to mouth. A single mistake in pronunciation could unravel the spell. That's why they trained from birth, raised in silence, bathed in ink, eyes covered until their minds could see symbols without needing light. That's what the name meant. lightless flame, fire that didn't burn, vision that didn't come from eyes. The manuscript hinted that the pharaohs knew about them, that even the most powerful kings of Egypt feared their silence. One legend claimed a young pharaoh tried to imprison the keepers, jealous of their knowledge. The next morning, he was found on the palace roof, eyes gone, mouth sealed shut with wax from an unknown source. No one challenged them after that. Over time, as Egypt changed and foreign powers took over, the keepers faded from memory, but the manuscript claimed they didn't die out. They moved underground, some into the deserts, some into the catacombs beneath, lost cities, waiting, protecting what they called the final word. A phrase so powerful it could undo the world if spoken by the wrong mouth. The Vatican took this part of the manuscript seriously. Too seriously. Notes in the margins show that entire teams were sent to follow the trail. Many never returned. One report, half burned, mentions a hidden chamber beneath a ruined temple. Inside were bones arranged in a spiral and walls covered in black paint. No light, no air. Only one marking was found intact on the wall. A flame, surrounded by eyes that had no pupils. Some scholars believe the keepers still exist, that they passed down fragments of the manuscript in secret, that the real reason the Vatican locked it away wasn't to protect the public. It was to keep the keepers from finding the rest of it. The manuscript didn't talk about gods the way most religions do. It didn't mention worship. No hymns, no commandments, just contact. The kind that leaves a mark on everything it touches. According to one section buried deep in the text, the gods weren't imagined, they were remembered. Ancient intelligences that walked this earth before history had a name. They weren't glowing figures in the sky. They weren't made of gold or stone. They were something else. Consciousness. Thought wrapped in form. The text describes them as burning minds. Not fire as we know it. Flame without heat. Light that moved like liquid and whispered secrets into the bones of those who saw it. That was the first flame. The spark that made humanity more than just animals. The manuscript claims that long before cities and kingdoms, a group of early humans made contact. Not by accident. They had been searching, listening. They called themselves the children of the ember. And when they found it, everything changed. These intelligences didn't give instructions. They gave symbols, visions, blueprints for how to change reality using only willpower and sound. One section describes a ritual where a human could merge with the flame for just a few seconds. In that moment, they would see every version of themselves across every possible timeline. Some went mad. Others came back changed. They spoke new languages, drew circles in the dirt that made animals freeze. One man supposedly touched a dying plant and brought it back to life, not with prayer, with memory. Because that's what the flame was really about, remembering, not just history, but the code beneath it, the true memory of matter, of time, of death. The gods, the manuscript says, weren't there to be worshipped. They were there to be understood. And if you understood them, even for a moment, you could rewrite your own fate. This kind of thinking scared the Vatican more than any curse or demon, because it wasn't evil, it was knowledge, pure, untamed. And it didn't ask for faith, it offered proof. The Church sent researchers to trace the origin of this flame myth. They found petroglyphs in caves in Sudan that showed humans reaching toward figures made of stars. No weapons, no thrones, just contact. Some of those same star patterns appeared in the manuscript. The match was exact. Thousands of years apart, thousands of miles away, same shape, same spiral, same flame. The final part of that chapter had only one line written in red ink and underlined 3 times. They did not leave. They became us. That's the part that keeps scholars up at night. Because if the gods were real and they merged with early humans, what does that make us now? Maybe the first flame never went out. Maybe we're just waiting to remember. It wasn't written like the others. No diagrams, no chants, just a single page surrounded by empty parchment, as if the rest of the book was keeping its distance. At the top, in script that shimmered even under candlelight, were 5 words. The ritual of recollection begins. The Vatican's translators didn't know what to make of it. Unlike the other spells, this one wasn't about controlling fire or bending space. It wasn't even about power. It was about memory. But not the normal kind. This was memory that lived outside your brain. Memory passed through blood, through bones, through time. The ritual claimed that every person carried echoes of past lives, ancient names, lost cities, conversations from languages that no longer existed, but the mind had sealed them off. Too many memories from too many lives would shatter a person's sense of identity, so nature buried them deep where they couldn't be touched. Until now, the spell didn't require herbs or sacrifices, just silence. A circle of obsidian dust and one phrase whispered backwards while staring into a mirror lit only by fire. Simple but dangerous. Because once the door opened, it wouldn't close until the memories were finished with you. The manuscript warned that time would start to slip. You might wake up thinking it's 3, A, D, or speak in a language no one around you understands. Some who tried the ritual forgot their own names, but remembered ones they hadn't heard in thousands of years. One line in the margin was especially haunting. He remembered being buried alive, but not this life. The one before. A Vatican researcher tested the spell in secret. He vanished for 3 days. When he returned, he was shaking, repeating the same sentence in Coptic over and over. I was there when the library burned. I was there when the sky turned black. I was there when the gods fell. The church tried to dismiss it, called it a hallucination, but they never found any drugs in his system. And when they brought in a Coptic historian, they were stunned. The sentence he kept repeating used a grammatical form that hadn't existed in any surviving text. It was older, purer, a version only a native speaker from 0 years ago would know. The Vatican sealed the page under glass, marked it as too unstable to translate further, but not before making several copies, quietly, for internal use. Some believe the ritual still circulates in fragments, whispered at underground gatherings, recited in dark rooms by those trying to remember what the world forced them to forget. They say it can restore not just memory, but ability, skills from previous lifetimes, lost knowledge, ancient strength. But the real risk isn't remembering who you were. It's forgetting who you are. It wasn't supposed to exist. Not in Rome, not in the modern world, but there it was, locked behind a thick panel of leaded glass, deep in the lower archives of the Vatican. No label, no explanation. Just a tiny black object sitting on a slab of marble. It looked like a medallion, but older, heavier, carved entirely from obsidian. And etched into its centre was a symbol that matched one thing and one thing only: the forbidden manuscript. The seal had been mentioned only once in the text. A side note, barely a paragraph. It was called the seal of Amun, not the Amun we see in Egyptian temples. This version came from a time before temples, before pharaohs, back when the gods still walked in shadow. According to the manuscript, the seal wasn't a symbol of power. It was a lock, a spiritual barrier meant to contain something that couldn't be destroyed, something that still pulsed with energy. The text described it as a fail-safe. If the rituals written in the manuscript were ever misused, the seal would activate, not with fire or sound, with forgetting. It would erase the memory of the spell itself from the minds of those nearby. Entire ceremonies lost in a blink. Entire languages wiped clean from human thought. The seal didn't destroy knowledge. It hid it. No one knew how the Vatican got it. Some say it was unearthed in a dig near Thebes and quietly handed over by a Jesuit agent. Others think it had been in their possession for centuries, even before the manuscript surfaced. The thing that shocked researchers the most wasn't its material or its shape. It was the fact that the seal still worked. Security footage from the archive showed something strange. Every week, a priest would come down to the vault with a notebook. He'd stare at the seal for a few minutes, write something down, then leave. But when investigators checked the notebook, every page was blank. Not erased, just empty, like the pen had never touched the paper. Even more unsettling, the priest had no memory of his visits. When asked about the seal, he looked confused, said he'd never heard of it. That's when they realized it wasn't just legend. The seal was active, and it was doing exactly what the manuscript claimed it would do. Later tests showed mild electromagnetic pulses surrounding the object, but not from any power source. It pulsed at irregular intervals, almost like it was responding to something or someone. One researcher claimed the seal hummed when certain phrases from the manuscript were spoken aloud. They stopped reading after that. The Vatican now keeps the seal under constant guard, not because they're afraid of someone stealing it, but because they're afraid of someone remembering what it's for. Because if the seal is still functioning, that means the threat it was designed to contain might still be real, waiting, listening, just beneath the surface. They didn't announce it, no press release, no memo. Just a red wax seal across the manuscript's casing and a single Latin phrase stamped underneath it in iron letters, Mundus Periculosus, the dangerous world. At first, no one understood what it meant. Was it a title, a warning, a name for the manuscript, or something it described inside? But then a quiet order came down from the top. All translation efforts were to stop immediately. Copies were to be burned, notes shredded. Any research involving the manuscript was to be sealed, and the scholars assigned to the project were reassigned without explanation. It wasn't just censorship, it felt like containment. The few who had read parts of the text before the lockdown started to whisper. They said the manuscript didn't just describe lost magic or forgotten rituals. It described a completely different version of reality. A reality where language could bend matter, where memory could shape the present, where ancient beings weren't worshipped because they were gods, but because they were terrifyingly powerful scientists who had once ruled Earth like a living laboratory. The Vatican had seen enough. Somewhere between the chapters on resurrection and the section on mirrored time, someone high up decided the truth was too dangerous. Not just spiritually, structurally. If people believed this manuscript, it could unravel not just faith, but the very fabric of what we call history. That's when they changed the classification from historical artifact to theological threat. Even the name they gave it, Mundus Periculosus, wasn't chosen lightly. It came from a suppressed text written in the 1400 400s by a monk who claimed to have seen visions of the world beneath this one, a place not of fire or punishment, but of knowledge too dense for the human mind to carry. According to him, accessing this world meant risking madness, or worse, remembering what humanity had chosen to forget for its own safety. The phrase had only appeared once in Vatican records before. Now it was back, branded onto a manuscript wrapped in obsidian leather and filled with words no one wanted to read out loud anymore. Behind the scenes, a different kind of order was unfolding. Security on the vault was increased. The researchers who had read even small fragments of the manuscript were sent to isolated postings or given mandatory sabbaticals. One reportedly tried to replicate a ritual from memory and ended up speaking a dead language for 3 days before collapsing from exhaustion. No one talks about the manuscript openly now. It's referred to only by initials or nicknames: the Codex, the Flame Book, the Forgetting Bible. But everyone who's worked in the archives knows exactly what it is and what it can do. The Vatican didn't lock it away because it was false. They locked it away because it might be true. And truth, when buried too deep, doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes it whispers. It was hidden in the margins, not in the manuscript itself, but in the Vatican's internal records. A side reference, barely a footnote in a document about artifact classifications. 3 words written in tight Latin script: Ordo Obscurae Eclipsi, the order of the eclipse. No one in the archive recognized the name. It wasn't listed in any known hierarchy, not in Jesuit rosters, Dominican rolls, or even the infamous Index Librorum Prohibitorum. And yet, its signature kept appearing. Stamped on reports about Egyptian relics, scribbled on memos regarding restricted vault access, and always tied to one theme: suppression of magical knowledge. Most people think of the Vatican as a religious body, but in the shadows it also functions as a filter. Not everything gets preserved. Some things get hidden, some truths get silenced. That's where the Order of the Eclipse comes in. According to the fragments uncovered, this secretive sect was created not to protect the faith, but to protect the illusion of history. Their symbol was simple: a black circle with a sliver of light, an eclipse, a world deliberately dimmed. The order dates back to at least the 17th century, though some insiders believe it may have been formed much earlier, possibly right after the fall of Constantinople. Their mission was clear: track down all texts, artifacts, and oral traditions linked to what they called pre-biblical manipulation. In other words, Egyptian magic, especially anything tied to the keepers of the lightless flame. They weren't monks. They weren't even traditional clergy. They were trained historians, linguists, and in rare cases, exorcists. Their job wasn't just to hide objects. It was to bury meaning, rewrite translations, plant false footnotes, mistranslate key phrases so that even if someone found a piece of the truth, they'd never understand what they were really looking at. A leaked document described one of their operations in Egypt during World War I. A hidden vault was discovered under a collapsed temple. Inside were scrolls that predated the Old Kingdom by centuries. One member of the team made the mistake of reading aloud from a partially translated glyph. He dropped dead within hours. The rest of the scrolls were burned. The site was flooded. And the surviving agent was sent back to Rome with a single phrase etched into stone. They remembered. The Order's methods were precise. They didn't just remove things from the world. They made sure those things were forgotten. Books rewritten. Graves moved. Myths turned into parables. They understood something most institutions didn't, that the real power of ancient Egypt wasn't its monuments, it was its memory, and the eclipse existed to erase it. To this day, the Vatican won't acknowledge the order exists. But the seal is still used, still stamped on certain boxes, still whispered about in restricted libraries, because some shadows don't fade. Some were designed to last forever. And if the order is still active, it means they believe the danger isn't over. It's just been sleeping. They say it's not a word. Not really. Not the way we think of words. It's more like a vibration wrapped in breath, a sound that shapes the space around it. In the manuscript, buried deep between diagrams of mirrored pyramids and maps of the invisible realms, there's a passage about the first name of God, not the ones we see in prayers or scriptures. Not Jehovah or Elohim, or even the sacred Tetragrammaton. This was something older, something hidden, something forgotten on purpose. The passage is written in a script that twists the eye, letters that loop in on themselves, and shift shape depending on the angle you're reading from. Scholars argued for months about whether it was meant to be read front to back or back to front, but one thing became clear. The name it described wasn't just a title, it was a key. According to the text, this name was uttered once, at the beginning of all things, a sound so perfect that it didn't just echo through creation, it defined it. Time, space, light, matter, all folded themselves around this one expression. It was the blueprint for reality itself, and then it vanished. Some say it was hidden by the gods to protect us. Others believe it was taken from us because we weren't ready, but the manuscript hints at something else, that the name still exists, just outside of time. Like a frequency, we've forgotten how to hear, and that anyone who remembers it could reshape the world. Not with magic, with memory. The Vatican called this section of the manuscript the most theologically dangerous part, because if it's true, then God isn't a distant force, but a code. And if the code can be spoken, then creation can be rewritten. Not in myth, in real time. That terrified them. One footnote from a Vatican translator described a nightmare he had after copying the name's phonetic outline. He said he dreamed of a library with no books, only echoes. And every echo said the same thing in different voices. Say it, and the world will forget itself. Another priest went further. He tried to vocalize the first syllable. Just one, witnesses said. The air around him cracked like glass. He collapsed and never spoke again. The church moved fast. That section of the manuscript was sealed behind 4 locks. The pronunciation guide was destroyed. Even the ink used in the original passage was analysed. It contained a pigment not found anywhere else in the known world, as if the page itself didn't want to be remembered. But some believe fragments of the name still survive, in chants, in ancient lullabies, in patterns found in temple carvings and desert winds, pieces of a puzzle meant to stay scattered, because if the full name is ever spoken again, time might fold, reality might blink, and we might find ourselves standing not in the world we know, but in the one that came before it, the one shaped by a single word. In temples older than memory, and tombs carved into mountains, ancient Egyptians painted their gods with features that don't match anything human. Long, stretched skulls, eyes like suns, fingers too thin and too many. These weren't just stylized drawings. The details were too consistent across centuries. Different dynasties, different pharaohs, same shapes, same strange proportions, same stare. The eyes were always the first thing people noticed. Massive, wide open, almost glowing, Some had rays coming from them, like little beams of light. Others had concentric rings, like a camera lens, frozen mid-blink. They weren't symbols of vision, they were symbols of watching, and they were everywhere. But what were they watching? Some believe these images weren't gods at all, that they were something else entirely, visitors maybe, or beings from a realm that isn't up in the sky but just outside what we call real. Egyptologists brushed it off for years, said the art was symbolic, said the skull shapes were artistic style or head bindings. But no one could explain why royal children had the same features, or why certain mummified remains showed skulls that couldn't belong to Homo sapiens. The manuscript doesn't name them, it just refers to them as the ones who arrived when the light bent. It says they didn't speak with mouths, but with thoughts. That they taught early priests how to align temples with star paths no one could see. That they drew maps of places under the earth and above the sky, places no one's been able to find since. Some carvings show them holding strange objects. Not staffs or ankhs, but rods that end in spirals or spheres. One painting shows a god touching a human forehead with a glowing disc, like passing on a memory, and the human's eyes turn gold. There's a story buried deep in a forgotten hymn. It talks about a pharaoh who looked into the eyes of one of these beings and remembered something. Not a past life, a past world, a place where stone bent and light had weight. He spent the rest of his life trying to return to it. And when he died, he asked to be buried upside down, facing the stars. The Vatican's records mention similar beings in documents locked in the Jesuit archive. Different names, same eyes, always watching, always silent. Some researchers believe the elongated skulls and radiant eyes were more than just physical features. They were signs, warnings maybe, that we weren't the first, that another intelligence once touched this planet and left pieces of itself behind. Not in machines, in memory. And if the eyes are still watching, maybe they're waiting, to see if we'll remember what we saw when we first looked back, before the sand covered it, before time blurred it, before we forgot that the gods might not have been gods at all, just eyes that never sleep. Somewhere deep in the manuscript, beneath layers of encrypted symbols and faded ink, is a single folded parchment. It's not a spell, it's not a warning, it's a map, but not of land or stars. It's called the Cartography of the Ka, and what it claims to map isn't a place, it's the soul. In ancient Egyptian belief, the Ka was one part of the human soul, the part that held memory, desire, identity, the part that lingered after death. Most thought it just stayed near the tomb, but this diagram shows something far more complex. Arrows, gateways, circles, and spirals. It looks like a maze, but it's not random. Every turn seems deliberate. Every path, lined with symbols that repeat across temples, scrolls, and dreams. At the top of the map, a tiny figure stands inside a human silhouette. That's life, ordinary, waking life. But just a few steps down, the body starts to fade, and the car begins to separate. The diagram shows the soul stepping into something called the field of reflection, a space between thought and death. In this space, you don't just remember your life, you remember other lives. Ones you've lived before, ones you might live again. Further along the path, strange names appear. The Hall of Mirrors, the river that flows backward, the temple without doors. Each one is marked with symbols that match things found in tomb carvings and on sarcophagus lids. But they've never been placed in order like this, never connected as a journey. The manuscript suggests this wasn't just mythology, it was instruction. Scholars who've seen the map say it resembles something like a psychological operating manual, that it's not just about death, but how to navigate memory itself, how to access the deep layers of consciousness where time folds in on itself, places where dreams become keys. One Vatican translator noted a phrase repeated throughout the diagram: "He who knows the route does not fear the return." It implies that death isn't an end. It's a loop, a process. And that, with the right knowledge, the Ka can choose its path. It doesn't have to forget. It doesn't have to start over. What makes this even more unsettling is that parts of the map overlap with modern brain scans. The spiral in the center of the diagram mimics the shape of the hippocampus, the part of the brain tied to memory. How could a map drawn thousands of years ago know that? Maybe the keepers of the lightless flame weren't just priests. Maybe they were travelers, not of land or sea, but of consciousness. Maybe they charted the soul the way astronomers charted stars. Not because they feared death, but because they wanted to bring something back. A memory, a message. Or maybe, just maybe, a way out of the cycle. The Vatican keeps the map sealed, not because it's dangerous to look at, but because once you see the path, you start to recognize it in dreams, in moments of déjà vu, in the silence between your thoughts, like it was always there, waiting for you to remember. In the final third of the manuscript, right after a section filled with strange drawings of fireless torches and floating eyes, there's something that doesn't look like a spell or a warning. It looks like a path, a vertical path. 7 levels stacked one on top of the other, connected by thin beams of light. At the top, something blinding. At the bottom, something broken. The text calls it the Ladder of Light. Unlike other sections that are full of symbols and code, this one reads like a manual. Each rung of the ladder has a name. The first gate is called waking. The next is remembering, then knowing, then separating. After that, names start to blur into symbols too ancient for any known tongue. But the instructions are clear. You don't climb this ladder with your body, you climb it with your mind. The manuscript describes it as a kind of inner ascent. Not through prayer, not through belief, but through acts of conscious remembrance. The first step is awareness of your own thoughts, then memories. Then memories that don't feel like yours. The text warns that confusion is part of the journey, that to climb is to dissolve what you think you are, until only the essential self remains. What's strange is how similar these steps are to early Christian mystical writings. In forgotten monastic texts and obscure gospels never canonized, there are echoes of this ladder. Descriptions of a soul ascending through stages of illumination. Saints and hermits spoke of leaving their bodies, floating above themselves, seeing light so bright it had weight. Some said they heard music with no source. Others said they were shown the true names of things. The Egyptian manuscript predates these writings by centuries, but the imagery is identical. The ladder, the light, the rungs made of memory and silence. Some believe the early church didn't invent its mysticism, it inherited it and hid the origin. The Vatican's private notes on this section mention a monk named Erasmo who attempted the full ascent. His writings were confiscated, his room sealed. He had written that the ladder wasn't metaphor, that the mind, when pushed to its limit through solitude and certain phrases, whispered rhythmically, could detach. He called it the soft exit. He said he saw the top of the ladder, and what was there didn't look like heaven. It looked like a mirror. The idea that the soul can rise through levels of self until it meets itself is ancient. but dangerous, because it doesn't require a priest or a church or even a god. Just a method, just the right sequence of thoughts, breath, and stillness. The manuscript doesn't call it salvation, it calls it alignment. The moment when light recognizes light, and the ladder disappears because you realize it was never a structure, it was a reflection of where you already were, of who you've always been. Deep beneath Vatican City, far below the marble floors and golden ceilings, there's a level of the archives that doesn't appear on any official map. Most people know about the Vatican Library, and some even whisper about the secret archives. But almost no one outside the highest circles has heard of the Black Vault. Its true name is written in Latin above the sealed entrance, Anima Externa, the outer soul. It's not a room, it's a series of chambers, each colder than the last. The walls are thick and damp, reinforced with stone from the original catacombs. Access is restricted to a handful of individuals who carry no names, only titles. The keys aren't digital. They're ancient, carved from bone and obsidian, stored in reliquaries guarded like holy weapons. Inside the vault, the church doesn't keep gospels or confessions, it keeps threats. Scrolls too dangerous to destroy, relics too powerful to display. Among them are artifacts that don't match any known period of Christian history. Scrolls covered in proto-hieroglyphs, scarabs preserved in golden resin, and a mirror so old the silver has faded from the glass, leaving behind a reflection that always seems to watch back. One document is labelled simply Ritus Luxor. It describes rituals performed in the shadow of the Temple of Ammon long before Christ was born. The rites involve symbols etched into skin using black oil and gold dust. They were said to open memory gates in the soul, allowing communication with something called the voice beneath. The Vatican's marginal notes describe these practices as theological heresy, but admit that attempts to replicate them caused unexplainable effects in subjects. Another object is a sealed box containing what looks like a dried tongue. The label claims it once belonged to a priest who spoke the first word, a sound not meant for human throats. Those who heard it reportedly lost all sense of time. Some thought they had died, others thought they had never been born. Why would the Vatican keep these things instead of destroying them? That's the question no one can answer clearly. One theory is that they don't dare, that destroying such items might trigger the very forces they were meant to keep buried. Another is simpler, that the church doesn't keep them out of fear, it keeps them out of interest. Not to protect the world from ancient Egyptian magic, but to learn from it, to use it. What's most chilling is a letter buried in the back of a file folder, written by a cardinal in the 1800s. It says, "The rites of the Egyptians are older than sin. If Christ is the key, they are the lock, and we must never let them turn. So the black vault stays shut. Its lights flicker but never go out, and inside, history holds its breath, waiting for someone to ask the wrong question, or maybe the right one, the one that unlocks everything." There's a page in the manuscript that scholars still whisper about in private. It's not long, maybe a few hundred words, but what it describes unsettles even the most hardened researchers. It's a ritual, one so strange, so specific, that even those trained in Egyptian mysticism hesitate to speak it aloud. The text refers to it as the invocation of the mirror, and it centers around an object called the Mirror of Ra. Unlike most mirrors made from bronze or glass, this one is carved from a single slab of obsidian, black as night, and polished until it reflects not just your face, but something else, something deeper. The passage warns that the mirror is not meant for vanity or beauty. It is a tool, a key to summon the true self, a version of you that exists outside time, stripped of memory, fear, and illusion. The ritual itself is simple in appearance, but terrifying in intention. It must be done alone, in a darkened chamber, with no symbols, no light, no distractions. The obsidian mirror must be placed at eye level. The participant stares into it and recites a single phrase written in proto-hieroglyphs. No one has ever fully translated the phrase, but a rough approximation means, "I remove the mask." What happens next is where accounts begin to fracture. Some say the mirror shows not a reflection, but a shadow that moves independently. Others say it reveals forgotten memories, moments you've tried to bury so deep, even your own mind forgot they existed. A few claim that if you look long enough, the mirror blinks. Not you, it. The Vatican file on the Mirror of Ra includes a warning scrawled in red ink. The subject cannot be trusted post-ritual. That one sentence has led to countless theories. What does it mean to summon your true self? And why would that self be dangerous? In Egyptian myth, Ra is the sun god, the one who travels through the underworld each night to fight chaos and rise again in the morning. But this ritual has nothing to do with the sun. It's about darkness, about facing what lives beneath your surface. One priest's notes, written in trembling Latin, describe a test subject who performed the ritual and claimed they woke up afterward. When asked what that meant, the subject simply said, "I was dreaming before. This is the real world." No one could explain why their voice echoed oddly in the recording, or why their eyes didn't match the pre-ritual photos. Since then, the Vatican has kept the Mirror of Ra locked away. Not destroyed, just sealed. Maybe they're afraid of what it might reveal, or maybe they already tried it once and didn't like what they saw. Because the scariest thing in the world isn't a demon or a ghost. It's the truth staring back at you and realizing it's not really you at all. There's a passage buried deep in the manuscript that doesn't talk about gods or spells or secret artifacts. It talks about forgetting. Not the kind that comes from old age or trauma or the passing of time. No. This was something else. A ritual, a deliberate act. And if what the text says is true, then much of what we've lost from the ancient world wasn't taken by fire or war. It was erased on purpose. The text describes something called the Pillars of Forgetting. According to the manuscript, these weren't physical pillars, like stone monuments or towers. They were moments, events. Carefully constructed ceremonies carried out by priests who didn't worship any one god, but served a darker purpose, guardians of silence. Their job wasn't to remember, it was to make the world forget. The ritual went like this. At certain sacred sites, usually beneath temples or near water, a group would gather. Always 7, always masked. The person whose memory was being targeted would be brought forward, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. A chant would be spoken not loud, but slow and steady, like a lullaby for the soul. Then, one of the masked priests would whisper a word into the subject's ear, just one word. The manuscript never reveals what the word was, only that once it was spoken, the forgetting began. The person would start to lose things, not just names or faces, but places, skills, whole lifetimes. And here's where it gets even stranger. The ritual didn't just erase their memories. It changed the memories of everyone who knew them. Families would wake up and feel something was missing but couldn't name what. Scrolls would fade, paintings would blur, as if the universe itself had agreed to forget alongside them. If this sounds impossible, consider this. Archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian temples that reference ceremonies with no known purpose, symbols that appear in no other writings, patterns of 7, faded masks painted on walls beneath layers of plaster. And every time a clue is found, it's always near a water source, just like the manuscript says. The Vatican reportedly tried to recreate the ritual in a controlled environment sometime in the 1940s. The experiment was classified, but one of the surviving documents contains a chilling line. It says, "Subject forgot not only who he was, but that he had ever existed at all." Imagine that, not just memory loss, existence loss. It raises a terrifying question. What if some of our greatest thinkers, artists, prophets, or inventors were simply unmade? Not by fate or accident, but by design. What if the past we're trying to uncover is full of deliberate gaps, holes carved out with precision, so we'd never ask the right questions? The manuscript says the pillars were eventually dismantled, but not destroyed, just hidden. Maybe in vaults, maybe in ruins, or maybe inside us, locked behind doors we don't know how to open. Not yet, anyway. There's something strange about the way power is dressed. Crowns, robes, rings, they're not just decoration, they're symbols. And symbols always have history, even if we've forgotten where they came from. Take the mitre, for example, that tall split hat worn by bishops during ceremonies. Most people think it's just part of religious tradition, but the manuscript offers a very different story, one that traces the mitre back to the hot sands of ancient Egypt, to a crown shaped like a serpent. The serpent crown wasn't made of gold or jewels, it was made of belief. Worn by the high priests of Ammon, it curved upward and split at the top, mimicking the open mouth of a cobra. The serpent, in Egyptian magic, represented knowledge, rebirth, and hidden power. To wear the crown was to channel those forces. It wasn't just a headdress, it was a tool, a kind of spiritual antenna. Now here's where it gets eerie. When early Christian bishops began adopting ceremonial headwear, the design they settled on wasn't random. The mitre mirrors the same split shape, the upward curve, the symbolism of something rising from the forehead. Some scholars claim it was just aesthetic, that it was about visibility during Mass, but the manuscript says otherwise. It suggests that the earliest bishops weren't just borrowing Egyptian styles, they were repurposing Egyptian rituals. According to one hidden passage, the first bishops of Alexandria were trained in both Christian and Egyptian rites. They understood the spiritual weight of the serpent crown and adapted it into Christian liturgy. But instead of calling it magic, they called it divine authority. Instead of invoking Ammon, they spoke of Christ. Yet the energy flowing through the mitre remained the same. It was about control, not just of people, but of memory and mystery. Somewhere along the line, the origin story was buried, on purpose. The Vatican Archives reportedly contain diagrams showing the evolution of the crown across centuries, from the serpent's hood to the bishop's mitre. And hidden among those pages are warnings that the symbol still holds power, that whoever wears it must be careful what they carry in their thoughts during Mass, because the crown does not forget. Even today, some high-ranking clergy refuse to wear the mitre, not for fashion reasons, but because of what it might awaken. There are rumours of priests who, while wearing it, began to speak in ancient languages, or see visions of temples that no longer exist, as if the headdress remembers every head it sat upon, including those who served gods far older than the Church. So the next time you see a bishop raise his hands in blessing, look at the shape on his head. You're not just looking at a hat, you're looking at the ghost of a serpent. A memory from a time when magic was real and power was worn like a crown. Some stories are too familiar. A man dies and rises again. Water turns to wine. Light defeats darkness. But what if those stories weren't new? What if they were borrowed from something far older, something buried deep beneath the sands of Egypt? The manuscript doesn't whisper this, it shouts it, page after page, filled with symbols and rituals that look almost identical to Christianity. But they come from temples that crumbled long before the Gospels were written. There's a passage in the manuscript that lists 7 rites used by a forgotten priesthood in Upper Egypt. The first is a purification by water. The second involves oil. The third, a sacred meal eaten in silence. And the 7th, a ritual death and return, played out in a darkened chamber beneath a stone altar. The structure is almost identical to the sacraments still practiced in churches today. But here's the thing. These rites were recorded more than 1,000 years before the time of Christ. It doesn't stop there. The manuscript describes robes stitched in specific patterns, marked with crosses and suns and eyes, symbols worn by the priests of the Temple of Osiris. One robe even features a sash wrapped 3 times around the waist, just like the cords used in certain Christian monastic orders. There are even drawings of the Ankh, the Egyptian sign of life, held up in blessing. Its shape closely resembles the cross, but with a loop at the top. Early Christian missionaries in Egypt sometimes wore it, mistaking it for a local version of the crucifix. Or maybe they knew exactly what it was and hoped no one would notice. The text refers to this blending as the Great Masking, a moment in history when one faith was painted over another, when temples became churches, when gods were renamed saints, and when symbols once used to summon ancient power were rebranded as holy decorations. Even the Christian halo, that glowing ring behind saints' heads, appears in Egyptian tombs as a solar disk above the gods. It meant divine presence long before it meant holiness. And here's the part the Vatican doesn't like talked about. The manuscript suggests this wasn't a natural evolution. It wasn't a case of coincidence. It was strategy. A slow, deliberate campaign to absorb the spiritual structures of Egypt and bury their origins under layers of doctrine. So when a peasant knelt in prayer, they were unknowingly reenacting rituals once offered to Isis, Horus, or Ammon. Some of the earliest church fathers wrote warnings about this, that too many of the faithful were still thinking in Egyptian terms, that the temples had fallen, but their spirits lived on in the practices of the new church. Those letters were buried too, hidden in dusty corners of monasteries and misfiled under forgotten names. The manuscript calls it stolen divinity, a theft not of gold or relics, but of memory. Because if people remembered where these rites came from, they might start asking different questions. And some institutions were built on making sure they never do. In a quiet corner of the manuscript, buried beneath pages of symbols and warnings, there is a ritual described only as the listening. It doesn't scream for attention. It almost feels like it was meant to be missed. But those who found it say it reads like instructions for something ancient, something forbidden. A method for hearing voices long thought silent. Not metaphorically, literally. The ritual begins with stillness, not just silence, stillness, the kind where your breath feels too loud. You sit in complete darkness, inside a chamber marked with carvings of eyes and spirals. A circle of obsidian dust is drawn around you, and in the centre a relic must be placed. Not just any object, It has to belong to the dead. A bone, a tooth, even a piece of clothing, something that still remembers. The manuscript is clear about that. Memory lives in matter. Then comes the chant. It's not words, it's tones, frequencies, hums that rise and fall like breath. The symbols used to notate it don't match any known language. But when they were played through a frequency generator, researchers claimed to feel vibrations in their chest. One even said he heard his grandmother's voice whispering his name. No one laughed. What's even stranger is how similar this all sounds to something much more familiar. The Christian practice of relic veneration. Bones of saints placed in golden boxes. People gathering around them to pray, to ask for guidance, to feel closer to the divine. But the Church always claimed it was symbolic, a reminder of the holy. The manuscript suggests otherwise. It says, bones don't forget. That matter can store voices the way wax stores a fingerprint. If the ritual is done right, you don't just remember the dead, you hear them. One Vatican report, now sealed, mentions a monk who performed this ritual alone in a crypt beneath an Italian basilica. He emerged 3 days later, pale and shaking. He couldn't speak for hours. When he finally did, he wrote a single phrase over and over, "They're still here." He was transferred to a remote monastery in the Alps. No one's heard from him since. The early church tried to erase this idea. They replaced the ritual with controlled relic veneration. They told people to pray, not listen, to worship, not remember. Because if people knew the dead could speak, they might ask what else had been hidden, and what the voices might reveal if they were finally allowed to finish their story. The manuscript ends the ritual with a final instruction. After the voice is heard, you must erase the circle, burn the relic, and forget the words. Because the longer the connection stays open, the more the living start to fade. Listening is safe, but only for a moment. Some say the ritual is a myth. Others say it's been performed in secret for centuries. But one thing is clear. Memory in the ancient world was never just a thought. It was a presence, a voice, an echo, waiting. Inside the oldest layers of the manuscript, nestled between faded diagrams of constellations and spells carved in a language no one speaks anymore, there's a passage that almost doesn't belong. It describes a temple, not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, but in Philae, the island that once held the great temple of Isis. And within that temple, something strange was said to appear. The text speaks of luminous beings descending in shafts of gold light. Their eyes were not human, their faces shifted like flame. Their wings, yes, wings, were made of something that shimmered like molten glass and moved without sound. The priests called them the firewalkers, others called them the voices of the sky. But the descriptions are impossible to ignore. These were not Egyptian gods as we know them. They were something else, something older, or maybe newer. And the word used to describe them in the margins, written in a much later hand, is one that changes everything. Malachim, angels. That word doesn't belong in ancient Egyptian texts. It comes from the Hebrew for messenger. In Christian scripture, angels are sent to deliver warnings, carry out divine orders, or protect sacred people. But in this version of the story, these beings are not just messengers, they're teachers. The manuscript claims they taught the priests of Isis how to shape sound into power, how to open the mind like a gate, how to leave the body without dying. In the temple, they were not worshipped, they were obeyed. The priests built chambers underground, where these beings would descend. Carvings found near the site matched the descriptions in the text. Winged figures with radiant halos, hands outstretched, eyes glowing like suns, and always a circle behind them filled with symbols that no one can read. What's even stranger is that some of these carvings were chiseled away in ancient times, replaced with more traditional imagery, almost as if someone wanted to erase the visitors from memory, but they missed a few. And when these surviving carvings were compared to early Christian angel art, the similarities were hard to dismiss. There's even a ritual mentioned in the manuscript. It was called the Flight of the Flame, a ceremony to summon these beings during a lunar eclipse. It involved singing tones that no human voice could naturally produce. The text warns of using it without preparation. One line reads, "They answer only to light, but they remember darkness." That line has been circled in red ink in at least 3 Vatican-held copies. So what does this mean? Were angels always part of Egyptian religion? Or were they something else entirely that crossed boundaries no one expected? The Church has long held that angels are uniquely Christian or Judeo-Christian. But if this manuscript is right, those glowing figures we see in stained glass windows may have first stood beneath pillars carved with hieroglyphs, not to guard heaven, but to guard something buried deep below it. And maybe, just maybe, they never left. They called it preservation, protection, the safeguarding of souls. But the truth looks different when you follow the trail of missing scrolls, burned libraries, and rewritten texts. Hidden deep in the archives of European monasteries are reports that span centuries, reports of ancient Egyptian manuscripts quietly disappearing, of entire temples being stripped of their carvings, of books being taken not to be studied, but to be sealed away. It didn't start all at once. At first, the early church simply ignored the old magic. They dismissed it as pagan superstition. But something changed. Something must have shifted behind closed doors, because suddenly the records show a coordinated effort, a plan. From Alexandria to Rome, orders were sent out. Locate any Egyptian text that referenced the stars, the soul, or the power of the spoken word. Remove it, replace it, destroy it if necessary. In one document, dated to the 12th century, a Jesuit scholar writes of acquiring a scroll called the Breath of Thoth. He notes it was found in a sealed tomb near Luxor and contained spells for memory retrieval and soul travel. The scroll was sent to the Vatican and never mentioned again. In the margins, someone later added a single Latin phrase, periculosum est, it is dangerous. Another letter from a monk in the 1400s complains that texts are being taken from libraries under the pretense of being heretical, only to vanish without a trace. He describes one book in particular, written in a shimmering ink that seemed to move when held to candlelight. That book too was taken. No explanation, no return. Over time, the campaign became more aggressive. Statues of Egyptian gods were defaced, temples converted into churches. Knowledge that didn't align with the new timeline of creation was declared blasphemy. Magic was labelled demonic. And memory, true memory, was replaced with doctrine. But here's the strange part. In private, some church scholars seem to believe these texts held real power, not metaphorical, literal, that the old Egyptian magic could open doors not meant to be opened. A 17th century papal advisor even warned that one such door had already been cracked. He wrote of visions, of voices that came through in forgotten languages, of dreams that turned to ash. The war wasn't just against Egypt, it was against what Egypt remembered. against a time when humans walked beside beings of light, when the soul was mapped like a constellation. When language itself could reshape the world, the Church didn't just want to silence these memories. They wanted to make sure no one even knew to ask the questions. And maybe that's the scariest part, that the most dangerous thing isn't what was hidden, it's what was forgotten on purpose. Because if memory is power, then forgetting is control. And those who control what we remember might just control who we become. It started as a glitch. A blurry image posted on an obscure message board late at night. Just a torn page, faded and cracked, covered in strange symbols that didn't match any known script. Most people scrolled past it without a second thought. But to those who recognized it, it was a scream from the past. A fragment from the manuscript they thought had been erased forever. The one locked away. The one no one was supposed to see. Within hours, the post was taken down. The user account was deleted, but not before someone saved the image. It spread like wildfire through encrypted forums, Discord servers, and private inboxes. People began decoding it, comparing it to ancient hieroglyphs, early Semitic writing, even Sumerian tablets. But nothing matched. The symbols didn't follow any known grammar. They bent the rules of language. Some even looked like diagrams more than letters, as if the page wasn't meant to be read, but activated. The Vatican noticed. Fast. The day after the image surfaced, strange things began happening. A digital copyright claim, traced to a law firm with ties to the Holy See, was filed against the image. Then servers hosting copies of it crashed or went offline. Academics who shared it received warnings. One professor at a European university who posted an analysis video had her entire channel removed. No explanation. Just gone. But the panic wasn't about copyright, it was about control. Because buried within the fragment were 3 words no one expected to find. Latin words, written in the margins in a different ink. Anima externa est realis. The external soul is real. That changed everything. Suddenly, it wasn't just a relic, it was a threat. A challenge to centuries of theology. If the external soul existed, as the fragment suggested, then memory, identity, even salvation might not work the way we were taught. That kind of idea doesn't just shake beliefs, it tears them down. A leaked email from a Vatican communications advisor revealed internal chaos. They didn't know how the fragment got out. They didn't know how much more was coming. And, worst of all, they didn't know who had the original. Meanwhile, an anonymous group claimed they had more pages. They began posting riddles online, clues hidden in music files, and satellite maps. One message simply said, "The memory has not been lost, it was only waiting." The Vatican went silent. But for a moment, something cracked. A sliver of forbidden truth slipped into the world. A piece of a manuscript that had once been chained in the dark, and people saw it, really saw it. No one knows who leaked the fragment, or how long they'll survive. But one thing is clear, the war on memory is not over, and some stories refuse to stay buried. His name was Father Matteo Darko, a quiet man, always seen in the back rows of Vatican assemblies, never speaking unless spoken to. He wore thick glasses, walked with a slight limp, and worked in the archive division nobody ever talked about. Deep below the apostolic library, past doors that required more than just keys, places that needed clearance, and silence. He was a records keeper, a soul counter, as the other archivists joked. He catalogued items that didn't officially exist. Sealed scrolls, burnt manuscripts, boxed relics that glowed under the wrong kind of light. And then there was the document, the one bound in black, the one the church never fully decoded. It came through his hands 6 times in 20 years. And each time he recorded its presence, he also made a note in a private journal. Not digital, not typed, ink on paper. Hidden inside a false book cover labelled The Lives of Saints. Weeks before the International Historical Conference in Florence, rumours began to circle that Father Darko had been invited to speak. Not on the main stage, just a closed panel. Topic: discrepancies in the dating of early Christian relics. But someone leaked the pre-conference schedule. His name was listed under a session titled Anomalies in Ecclesiastical Chronology, and beneath it, a subnote includes first-hand observations from Vatican repositories. That was enough. 3 days before the conference, Father Darko vanished. Not retired, not reassigned, vanished. His apartment was found untouched. Passport on the table. Tea still warm. No sign of struggle, no note. The last image of him comes from a grainy security feed. He is seen leaving the archive building just after midnight, carrying a leather satchel and glancing over his shoulder. The footage cuts out after 7 seconds. The Vatican issued no public statement. When asked, a spokesman simply said Father Darko had taken a leave of spiritual reflection. But insiders whispered something else. That someone had broken protocol. That a document tagged Mundus Periculosus had been signed out under his name and had not yet been returned. A week later, another strange event occurred. An unsigned envelope was delivered to the home of a linguistics professor who had once trained with Darko. Inside was a single torn page from a private diary. It read, "They warned me, but I had to look. I had to know what it meant. The map is not a metaphor. The soul moves. Memory lives beyond the body, and someone out there is hunting the keepers." The handwriting was confirmed to be his. Whether Father Darko ran, was taken, or became something else is still unknown. But his disappearance was not just an isolated case. It was a signal that even within the most guarded places on earth, memory leaks. Pages slip through cracks, and when they do, the people who read them sometimes disappear. It wasn't a calendar in the way we understand calendars. No months, no weeks, no Sundays or leap years. It was a spiral. A looping sequence of glyphs, symbols, and planetary alignments that looked more like art than timekeeping. But buried within the folds of the forbidden manuscript was a diagram titled The Cipher of Osiris. At first glance, it just seemed like decorative mysticism, golden ink spiralling outward from a central eye. But then someone noticed the points of intersection. They matched solar eclipses. Not just any eclipses, ones that hadn't yet happened when the manuscript was believed to be written. A Jesuit researcher tried to decode it using Gregorian reference tables. Nothing matched. The dates fell out of sync. Some overlapped centuries. Others pointed to no known day at all. It was as if the manuscript followed a different version of reality, a different framework for time. One that didn't measure from Christ's birth or Caesar's calendar, but from something much older, something beneath even Egyptian dynasties. One particular curve on the spiral lined up perfectly with a massive volcanic event in 535 AD. The same event, some historians believe, triggered a mini ice age. But here's the catch. The manuscript had no year 535. In fact, it skipped entire ranges of years. Instead of counting forward linearly, it marked time in cycles of memory, eras of forgetting, Moments when history was rewritten or erased. These weren't just days passing, they were edits, cuts, splices in the reel of human civilization. One line from the translated margin read, "Time is not forward, it is echo and shadow. He who bends memory bends the world." The Vatican locked that section of the document almost immediately. The researcher who made the discovery was reassigned, his notes confiscated, but not before a snapshot of the spiral leaked onto a private server used by astronomers. It triggered a wave of decoding attempts. One physicist in Prague noticed that certain segments of the spiral matched lunar cycles, but in reverse. Another in Cairo proposed that the calendar wasn't celestial at all, but psychological, that each glyph represented a collective event of trauma or enlightenment in the human mind. What disturbed the church wasn't just the weird dating system. It was what the cipher implied. That history is not fixed, that someone or something had already tampered with time and left instructions in code, not to predict the future, but to remind us of a past we no longer remember. There is a theory that the cipher of Osiris was a tool for re-entry, a way to jump back into timelines that had been severed, to relive what had been cut out. But decoding it comes with risk, because once you start to see how time bends, you begin to feel the edits in your own memory. You start to notice what's missing, the names you once knew, the places that never made it into the books, and you realize maybe time didn't forget, it was told to. They thought it was just decorative. Tiny star symbols scattered across the manuscript's margins, like constellations sketched by a bored scribe. But someone noticed a pattern. A few symbols matched known constellations, Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades. Only they weren't where they should have been. Not for the skies of 3000 BC, not for any known Egyptian calendar. When they plotted the positions using modern star mapping software, the results didn't make sense. The sky the manuscript described had never existed unless you turned back the clock much, much farther. The stars shift very slowly over time. It's called precession, like a wobble in Earth's axis that moves the sky in cycles lasting over 25 years. By rewinding that wobble, astronomers can guess what the night sky looked like thousands of years ago. And according to those calculations, the sky described in the manuscript didn't match 3000 BC. It matched around 500 BC. That date hit like a lightning bolt, because 500 BC is when the constellation Orion would have perfectly aligned with the 3 pyramids of Giza if they had existed that far back. Most Egyptologists dismiss the idea. They say the pyramids were built much later, around 2500 BC. But the manuscript star code seemed to whisper otherwise. That someone was watching the stars long before any of our current timelines admit. That someone wrote them down with such precision they could only have been first-hand witnesses. It wasn't just the sky map. The text included rituals that had to be performed under specific celestial conditions. Certain prayers only worked during solstice eclipses. Others demanded alignments between Sirius and an unknown object now lost to time. But every time researchers tried to align the instructions with known dates, nothing fit until they looked further back. Beyond dynasties, beyond Mesopotamia, back into the so-called darkness of prehistory. And there, things started to click. The ritual dates synced with alignments that would have occurred over 12,000 years ago, before writing, before agriculture, before anything we're taught about civilization, which raised the question, who were these people? Who wrote this? The text referred to them only as the first observers. It said they did not rule with kingship, but with knowledge of the stars, that they built no towers because they had no need to reach up. The heavens already bent low to speak to them. One fragment called them the architects of memory. Another said their cities were carved in reflection of the sky, so that the stars might never forget the earth. If true, then this manuscript isn't Egyptian in origin at all. Egypt might have inherited it, preserved it, built its civilization on top of a deeper one already lost. The Vatican labelled this section apocryphal, dangerous, a threat to the biblical timeline. Because if this star code is right, then history didn't begin in the Nile Valley. It started long before. With a civilization that remembered the stars so well, they wrote them down before time began. For centuries, the Church fought the stars. Not just the scientists who studied them, but the very act of looking up and asking questions. People were jailed for saying Earth wasn't the centre. Some were even burned. It always seemed like fear, like the Church was scared of space itself. But what if it wasn't about astronomy at all? What if it was about something much older, something buried beneath Egypt's sands? A truth they couldn't let out. Inside the manuscript is a passage that reads like a warning. It describes the sky not as decoration, but as a vault of memory. That every star is a point in a map, a code. And if you know how to read it, you can trace not only the past, but the future. The ancient Egyptians didn't just track stars to time floods or plant crops. They believed the heavens mirrored the soul, that what happened above shaped what happened below. The manuscript mentions a ceremony called the Night of Mirrors, performed only when specific constellations formed a shape they called the Eye of God. According to the text, this formation revealed messages hidden in starlight, patterns that only made sense when viewed from sacred sites aligned with ancient geometry. Pyramids, obelisks, temples, places that channeled sky into stone. The rituals promised wisdom, long life. Some even whispered that the right combination could open what they called memory gates, doorways to forgotten knowledge. But here's the part that made the Church panic. The Eye of God formation, when plotted by modern software, happened again in the early 1600s. Right around the time Galileo pointed his telescope to the sky and saw the moons of Jupiter. That's when things escalated. Galileo was silenced, his works banned, and behind closed doors, Vatican astronomers were ordered to stop looking in certain directions. Not because it was heretical, but because someone was afraid of what they might find. Documents buried deep in the archives reveal that Church scholars knew of these star patterns long before the age of telescopes. They had inherited Egyptian sky charts, translated pieces of the manuscript, and they knew what alignments to avoid. One memo even warns of a coming eye formation and urges priests to distract the public with celebrations and rewritten calendars. So when the Church attacked astronomy, it wasn't science they feared, it was memory. They weren't fighting against knowledge, they were fighting against remembrance. Because the sky, if read correctly, could undo everything. The dates, the stories, the power. The manuscript ends that chapter with a riddle, a phrase carved in 3 languages. The stars are silent until spoken to. It suggests the truth is still there, still watching, still waiting, but only if we dare to look up and ask the right questions. The war against astronomy was never about science, it was about control. And the stars, no matter how far away, still remember what we were never meant to know. There's a place in the Vatican most people don't know exists. Not the Sistine Chapel, not the secret archives. This one is older in spirit, but hidden in plain sight. the Vatican Observatory, a scientific outpost run by Jesuit priests. It sounds innocent enough. Telescopes, star studies, quiet monks tracking the heavens. But underneath it, buried beneath layers of stone and silence, there's a room that isn't on any public map. No signs, no lights, just a metal door sealed by a key few ever see. They call it the Hidden Chamber. And inside, the stars are not just scientific data, they're warnings. According to leaked documents, this chamber was discovered accidentally during a renovation in the early 1900s. Behind a wall of limestone was a staircase that led to a circular room with no windows and a domed ceiling painted black. On the walls were carvings that didn't match Catholic tradition. They looked older, Egyptian, symbols of the Eye of Ra, the scarab, a serpent winding through constellations. At first the workers thought they had found a forgotten crypt, but the symbols weren't funerary, they were astronomical. At the centre of the chamber is a giant stone table with star charts etched into its surface, but not modern ones. These constellations match no current sky. They show a different alignment of the heavens, one that only appears once every several thousand years. The same alignments described in the Egyptian manuscript. The same alignments connected to rituals of memory and resurrection. Next to the table is a smaller pedestal with a lens embedded in obsidian. If you place a candle behind it, the light projects an image onto the ceiling, not of the stars above today, but of how they looked in an ancient time, a lost age. Some researchers who secretly studied the room say the projection matches the sky over Egypt around 500 BC, a time mainstream historians claim was pre-civilization. But someone preserved that sky here, in Rome, in secret. There are journals kept by early Vatican astronomers that reference the chamber. One calls it the Room of Reversal and warns that it contains maps too close to the source. Another simply says, "The stars speak lies to those who don't listen in silence." It seems the Church didn't just inherit this knowledge, it tried to bury it, not out of hate, but fear. Fear that the heavens would reveal that history didn't begin when they said it did. When modern scholars requested access to this chamber, they were denied. Officially, it doesn't exist, but internal memos refer to its location. Security logs show restricted access during key celestial events, and the oldest blueprint of the observatory includes a room marked with only one word, Egyptus. The Vatican may have cloaked its past in ritual and robes, but below the telescopes, carved in stone and starlight, is a truth they never meant for us to find. A map of the sky, a key to the past, waiting for the right eyes to open. At the very end of the manuscript, there's a passage that doesn't read like history or ritual. It reads like a warning, like someone knew what was coming, not in a dramatic, apocalyptic way, but in a quiet, almost sorrowful tone, as if a light had once filled the world and someone had slowly, carefully stolen it. The passage says that this light wasn't sunlight or fire or anything you could see with your eyes. It was knowledge, not just facts or dates, but understanding, memory, the deep kind of truth that lives in the soul. It called this light the flame of knowing, and it said that when the flame is removed, people don't even realize it's gone. They keep going. They build churches and empires and systems of belief, but they're walking in a fog shaped by those who took the light. This part of the manuscript doesn't name names. It doesn't blame a single group, but it talks about engineers of belief. That's the exact phrase. Engineers, not prophets, not teachers, engineers, builders of systems, designers of reality, people who didn't just erase the old light. They replaced it with something artificial, a different kind of glow, one made from rules and obedience and fear. A light that looks holy on the outside, but doesn't lead you anywhere, just circles and shadows. The writer says that when humanity forgets the original light, it begins to confuse memory with myth. It forgets what it once knew, how to speak to the stars, how to read the earth, how to listen to the silence inside. It begins to fear questions, to label anything unknown as evil or heresy. The world becomes smaller, safer, controlled. But in that safety, something sacred is lost. One line stands out more than any other. It says, "The light was not hidden, it was hidden in us." That's what makes the warning feel different. It isn't about blaming the Vatican or any other group. It's about what we've allowed ourselves to forget, what we've given away, piece by piece, in exchange for comfort, in exchange for certainty. There's a final image, a kind of parable. It describes a candle placed inside a sealed jar, still burning but unseen. And the people outside the jar begin to believe the flame never existed. They stop looking for it. They stop asking about it. Until one child, not part of any religion or school, picks up the jar and opens it. The room lights up, not with fire, but with memory. That's how the manuscript ends. Not with a command, not even with hope. Just a quiet observation that the truth is not dead. It's only waiting. Waiting for someone to remember. For someone to notice the fog, to reach through it, and to feel something warm, still glowing underneath. That light was never lost, just stolen, and only from those who stopped looking. In the very last pages of the manuscript, there is no prayer, no chant, no curse, just a drawing. It's done in fading red ink, like it was copied from something much older. The lines are clean but strange, curved in ways that seem almost alive. At first glance it looks like a blueprint, or maybe a ritual diagram, but the longer you stare, the more it changes. Some say it resembles a tomb, others a cathedral. Some even see both at once. At the top of the page, it's labelled in a language that doesn't match anything else in the manuscript, but underneath someone had scribbled a translation in Latin, Porta Ultima, the last gate. The structure in the diagram is built in layers like steps going downward, but also spiralling inward. It starts above ground with what looks like an Egyptian temple gate, tall, narrow, and flanked by columns. But behind it is a chamber shaped like a Christian crypt, complete with arches and what appears to be an altar. Deeper still, the lines twist into a kind of labyrinth, with chambers labelled not with words, but with symbols, suns, moons, serpents, and eyes. One chamber is different. It's perfectly circular, placed at the very bottom and surrounded by markings that don't belong to any known culture. Inside that circle is a single phrase written in the same red ink: Locus excitatio, the place of awakening. No one knows where this place is. The drawing offers no coordinates, no map. But what's strange is that when researchers overlaid it with certain ancient floor plans from Egypt and old blueprints from cathedrals in France and Italy, there were eerie similarities. Not perfect matches, but close enough to raise questions. Too close to be coincidence. One Vatican document refers to it only once, and very vaguely. It calls it a heretical synthesis, a fusion of pagan architecture and sacred geometry meant to mislead the faithful. But then it adds a curious line: access forbidden, guard at all hours. As if they weren't just hiding knowledge, but hiding a door. The manuscript never says what the place of awakening actually does, but from the context, some think it was a space for something more than prayer, a place where reality could be rewritten or remembered, where the layers of belief could be peeled back, where the soul could be shown not just who it is, but where it's been. Maybe it was a metaphor. Maybe it's just a myth built on older myths. But the way the manuscript ends feels deliberate, not dramatic, not conclusive. Just this one last diagram left unguarded, like an open invitation or a challenge. Somewhere between the bones of Egypt and the stones of Rome, the diagram hints that a door still waits, not sealed, not locked, just forgotten. A last gate, not meant to be feared, but to be walked through, by those brave enough to ask where the path actually leads. The last page of the manuscript is almost blank. No illustrations, no long lines of ancient text, just a few words scratched in hurried ink like they were never meant to be found. It reads simply, "The gate will not open with stone, only with a key of flesh and thought." That's it. No explanation, no instructions. Just that line. Most assumed it was symbolic, a poetic way to say enlightenment comes from within. But buried in the margins of a Vatican translation file was a note from an unnamed scholar. It was short but chilling. Not a metaphor. The final rite requires a living vessel. In other parts of the manuscript, there are rituals that involve relics, objects carved in stone or sealed in glass. But this last part speaks of something else. A person, someone alive. Someone who unknowingly carries a piece of the lost memory inside them. Not in their blood, but in their mind. A buried echo. A truth that was silenced in the world, but somehow survived inside one human life. It doesn't say how this person is chosen, or how they would know what they carry. Only that they must remember something the world has been made to forget. Something so old that even time itself tries to reject it. A name, a sound, a feeling, no one is sure. But the manuscript insists the ritual only works if the key remembers, not believes, remembers. The Vatican's response to this part of the text was different. They didn't just file it away or mark it restricted. They locked it inside a special vault marked in red ink with the words prohibitus per defectum humani, forbidden due to human failure, as if even reading it was considered a risk to memory itself. What makes this even stranger is that during World War II, a monk stationed in southern Italy reported something unusual. A woman arrived at his chapel, claiming to be the lock the world cannot hold. She carried nothing, no relics, no credentials, just a strange calmness. When asked what she meant, she said, "The spell is not written, it is lived, and I have lived it." Days later she vanished. No name, no records, just gone. Some think she was mad. Others believe she was the living key the manuscript spoke of. A person who somehow retained a fragment of something erased from collective memory. It raises a terrifying possibility that the most powerful secrets in history cannot be sealed in books or buried in tombs, because sometimes the key is walking around in plain sight, hidden in a stranger's eyes, or a dream you can't explain, or a memory you've never had but somehow recognize. The final gate doesn't open with force, it opens with recognition, with someone remembering what no one else dares to. Not magic in the way we think of it, but something older, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. He worked alone, no university badge, no institutional funding, just an aging laptop, candlelight, and a folder of images smuggled out of the archives by a friend who never contacted him again. His name was Matteo D'Angelo, a linguist, a dropout, and, some say, the last person to read the manuscript in its entirety. Matteo wasn't the first to try translating it. Dozens had attempted partial phrases, poetic fragments, or isolated symbols. Most gave up. Some lost their minds. A few vanished. But Matteo didn't stop. He believed the manuscript wasn't just a record of rituals. He thought it was a warning, or a guide, or maybe both. He kept everything offline, printed every page, covered his apartment walls in sticky notes written in Latin, Greek, and something no one could identify. He cross-referenced it with Coptic liturgies, Egyptian funerary scrolls, and early Christian Gospels that had long been removed from public view. Day and night, he worked with trembling hands and whispered prayers. After 6 months of silence, he sent a message to a contact in Prague. One sentence: "It is done, but it should never be read aloud." That was the last anyone heard from him. 72 hours later, Matteo was found dead in his apartment. No signs of forced entry, no bruises, no blood. Just a toppled chair, a cracked mirror, and every page of the translation burned to ash in his kitchen sink. His laptop was missing. His phone had been wiped. The only clue left behind was a single phrase scrawled in black ink on the inside of his front door. "If you speak the truth in the wrong tongue, time listens." The police called it a stress-induced breakdown. Friends said it was suicide. But those who knew what he was working on saw it differently. They believed Matteo had finished the impossible. He had translated the full manuscript and paid the price. An anonymous post appeared on a hidden forum a few days later. It claimed Matteo had unlocked not just a translation, but a resonance. That the words themselves weren't meant to be understood in modern terms, but to awaken something older inside the listener. A vibration, a memory, maybe even a trigger. The post was removed within minutes. The account was deleted, but someone saved a copy. Matteo had discovered something the Vatican feared more than the contents of the book itself. Not the spells, not the diagrams, but the language. The original language that predated Scripture. A rhythm of vowels and sounds that did not describe reality, but shaped it. Words that remembered the world before time was counted. He had written that once the manuscript was spoken fully, even in a whisper, it could not be undone. And now no one knows where his translation is, or who else might be reading it. It started quietly. A blurry image on a forum no one had heard of. A single page from the lost manuscript, posted without comment, watermarked with a symbol most people couldn't recognize. At first, no one believed it. The font looked too old, the ink too faded. But then someone pointed out a line that matched a forgotten Coptic prayer. Then another found a diagram that mirrored the sacred geometry hidden in the floor of a church in Ravenna. Piece by piece, the silence cracked. Within days, the image had spread to the deep corners of the internet. It wasn't trending, it wasn't viral, but it was growing, like roots beneath stone. Scholars who'd spent decades locked in libraries were suddenly emailing each other at midnight. Historians who once laughed at myths were rechecking maps and ancient star charts. A linguist from Alexandria posted a video where she claimed the symbols in the manuscript weren't Egyptian at all, but something far older. She said the patterns weren't just writing, they were instructions. Then came the priests. At first, they denied everything. Just rumours, just fiction. But someone inside the Vatican leaked a memo. It was dated years ago and marked "not to be circulated." It warned of a fragment from an unclassified text that could erode doctrinal consistency if made public. The memo used the same name found in Matteo's burned notes. Lux Perdita, the lost light. That was when things shifted. A Jesuit scholar in Argentina broke ranks and released a paper about ancient rites that mirrored the Mass. He said they were found in tombs once guarded by the high priests of Amun. A monk in Ireland left his monastery and went on record claiming that the early church had hidden scrolls proving they did not invent the idea of resurrection. A bishop in Prague quietly asked for retirement, then disappeared altogether. The dominoes were falling. But it wasn't just scholars. Artists started painting strange scenes without knowing why. Poets began writing in symbols they swore came to them in dreams. Teenagers started making TikToks comparing Egyptian rituals to Christian sacraments and asking questions no one could answer without changing history. And underneath it all, people began remembering. Not facts, not dates, but feelings. A sense that something had been taken, that memory had been carved out and replaced. That the stories we were told weren't wrong, they were incomplete. The church responded. Press releases, interviews, carefully curated silence. But by then it was too late. The crack had widened, and once light gets in, it doesn't leave. Something had shifted. The world hadn't changed, but the questions had. And questions are hard to erase. It didn't end with a revelation. There was no final page that explained everything. No grand discovery that wrapped it all up. What came instead was a silence. Not the silence of secrecy or fear, but the kind that makes you pause, like something just out of reach is waiting for you to notice. And for those who followed the trail, who read every fragment and decoded every hidden line, a strange feeling began to settle in. What if this manuscript was never meant to be fully translated? What if it was not written to be understood with the eyes at all? The last page was blank. Or so they thought. But under certain light, under the right conditions, faint shapes began to shimmer. Not letters, not symbols, more like echoes. Patterns that matched nothing in any known language, but felt familiar. Like a memory you can almost grasp. A sound you've heard in a dream. A thought that isn't yours, but somehow belongs to you. Some believed it was the key. Others said it was the lock. The deeper people looked, the more the manuscript seemed to resist. Not by hiding, but by revealing too much. It didn't tell a story in the way books normally do. It suggested. It pointed. It stirred. And across different parts of the world, those who had once dismissed it began to feel it, not the fear the Vatican had warned about, something older, something nameless. There were reports of people dreaming the same dream, a flame with no heat, a voice without sound, a door made of mirrors that opened inward instead of out. Artists began painting it. Children described it. Elders remembered it. The lightless flame, not darkness, not fire, but something in between. Something that had always been there, hidden behind language, behind dogma, behind the stories we were taught to believe. It started showing up in old songs, in ancient carvings, in the pauses between chants. It was never named, but always there. And those who touched it didn't feel enlightenment. They felt memory. Not just personal memory, but something shared, something buried. As if the manuscript wasn't telling us something new, it was reminding us of something very old. The church called it a deception, a spiritual virus, a trick of ancient sorcery. But they couldn't stop the feeling, because the manuscript didn't just speak, it remembered for us. And in doing so, it pulled something to the surface. A question more dangerous than any secret. What if the real truth was never lost? What if it was never hidden in ink or stone? What if it was inside us all along? And what if this manuscript was not the message, but the match, and what it lit was something that could never be burned again, because memory is not a page, it is a flame, and now it's burning again.